The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day.
The next day.
The next day. The next day in a parallel universe. The very next day. The following day.
Tomorrow.
The very next evening. The next evening.
The next evening.
The next Christmas. Next level. Days later. 1 day later. 1 full day of fatherly fun later.
Day 2.
48 hours later. 2 days later.
Day 3.
72 hours later.
3 days later.
3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later.
Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 6 messy days later. Several days later.
Several days later.
Several days later. Several days later. Several long days later. Many disorderly days later.
1 week later.
1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 smelly week later. 1 soggy week later.
1 feeling week later.
1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
4 to 6 weeks later.
With 4 to 6 really imitate weeks.
6 to 8 weeks later. Several weeks later.
6 months later.
6 months later.
6 months later!
7 months later.
Several months later. Many months later.
12 years later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
2,000-ish years later.
3,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
4,000-ish years later.
5 billion years later.
1 entree later. An eternity later. An eternity later.
1 eternity later.
Opening night. A couple of hours later.
A lot of boring math later.
A lot of wallpapers later.
Very boring walk later.